Hello, I'm Cornell Clayton. I'm the director of the Thomas S. Foley Institute at Washington State University. And on behalf of the Institute, I want to welcome you to our event today, which features Amber Wichowsky, who will be speaking about inequality in American perceptions of social class. This is part of the Foley Institute's semester-long series on the politics of inequality, which examines the causes, consequences, and perceptions of rising inequality in the US and around the world. Many of you know that economic disparities have reached levels not seen in more than a century. Last year, the wealthiest 50 Americans had more wealth than the bottom 50%, or 165 million Americans combined. Moreover, the pandemic, the Time's Up movement, the Black Lives Matter protests, the immigrant crisis on the southern border, and many other events in recent months have all highlighted the nagging problems with racial, gender, social class, geographic, and other forms of inequality. There's no doubt that the growing severity, both in the perceptions and the reality of inequality, are giving rise to populist politics and social polarization in the US and elsewhere. Our series on the politics of inequality began with a distinguished lecture by Nobel Prize economist Angus Deaton from Princeton University, and includes nearly a dozen other lectures by distinguished scholars and commentators on various aspects of inequality, including today's discussion about perceptions of class inequality in the United States. If you'd like more information about this series or any of our events, please visit us at foley.wsu.edu. And if you miss these events, you can always catch them later on the Foley Institute's YouTube channel. Let me also thank the College of Arts and Sciences at WSU for their continued support of the Foley Institute and their support of this series. Now it's my pleasure to introduce today's guest, Amber Wichowsky, in class bias and election turnouts, the role of money in campaigns, and how public policy affects social inequality. Amber has published widely in top political science and in policy studies journals, and she's a frequent commentator to popular media outlets, including CNN, Fox News, NPR, and other news organizations. For today's talk, Amber will be drawing upon her recent book, co-authored with Megan Condon, titled The Economic Other, Inequality in the American Political Imagination, which was published by the University of Chicago Press just last year. Amber received her PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and was a postdoctoral associate at Yale University Center for the Study of American Politics. She previously worked at the U.S. Office of Management and Budget in Washington, D.C. Amber's indicated she plans to speak for about 30 or 40 minutes, and after that, we'll have time for discussion. If you have questions, I encourage you to send those to me at tsfoley@wsu.edu. Again, that's tsfoley as in Tom S. Foley at wsu.edu. So Amber, I'm going to turn the time over to you now, and I'll be back later with some questions from our audience.
Wonderful. Thank you so very much. I'm going to upload my PowerPoint presentation. So give me one moment here. Wonderful. I'm just waiting to make sure we have confirmation that folks can see the slide deck. Wonderful. All right. Well, thank you so very much for having me and inviting me to participate in just this wonderful speaker series that you've put together. Today, I'm going to talk to you and present the overarching argument and several empirical pieces for my book, co-authored with Megan Condon, The Economic Other, Inequality in the American Political Imagination. I'm going to show you how the broad currents of politics and inequality in the United States are driven by the simple comparisons we all make or don't make between ourselves and other people. So I want to begin with a simple premise. The human imagination is an engine of comparison. We get our bearings in a complex, changing world by comparing ourselves to other people. These comparisons shape the way we see the social order and ourselves. They govern our desires and discontents. They are often automatic, driven by context and impulse, so much so that they can happen just beneath our awareness. But often, if you think back, you can recognize them. So what social comparisons have you in the audience made today? Did you compare yourself to neighbors, to other scholars, students, people in the media, online, on the street, even for just a moment. Why do you think you made these particular comparisons and not others? Did you try to avoid or stop thinking about any comparison that perhaps made you feel a little uncomfortable? Did the comparisons make you feel, did it bring you up? Did it bring you down? Did you aspire, covet, pity, condescend? Do you think these kinds of everyday comparisons matter at all for the way you see politics? So we ask similar questions in the book, but from a much broader perspective. What kind of social comparisons are encouraged by an increasingly unequal America? Do we compare downward and feel great, or upward and feel little? And what are the consequences for our shared political and economic future? For as great thinkers that have been reminding us for centuries note, nothing is great or little otherwise than by comparison. So social comparison can take many forms, but our focus in the book is on cross-class comparison. In the real world, context and psychology combine to direct attention up toward the rich or down toward the poor, and govern the images that come to mind. Our core questions today are how often, under what conditions, and with what political results do these cross-class comparisons occur? On the one hand, there's reason to believe that downward comparison dominates. Imagining lower status others is an efficient way to feel confident and secure, satisfying what we might call the drum major instinct, that desire to be out front. Thinking of other people as inferior can produce self-confidence and buoy our sense of self. Great thinkers like Martin Luther King Jr., Virginia Woolf, they recognize this. And contemporary social scientists have repeatedly confirmed the observation. Downward comparison can elevate a person's sense of status, even when markers of status like money and achievements do not change. In an era marked by rapidly growing economic insecurity, Megan and I thought that perhaps people may be especially drawn to this kind of thinking, driven by the human desire to engage in downward comparison to elevate the self. What might be the consequences for our politics? Well, both Woolf and King emphasize that comparisons with others structure not only individual perception and self-concept, but power relations. King argued that the drum major instinct lies at the roots of racial resentment because people often satisfy their desire to compare downward by focusing on members of marginalized racial groups. Woolf made a similar argument about gender. She viewed this drum major instinct as foundational to patriarchy. In both cases, a drive away from upward and toward downward comparison serves to reinforce unequal power relations. Now, unlike downward comparison, upward comparisons can foster anxiety, weaken confidence, and lower perception of status. So one of our favorite examples of this is the case of the sad silver medalist. So bronze medalists consistently appear happier on the Olympic podium than silver medalists. The reason turns out to be a difference in the direction of social comparison. Bronze medalists tend to compare downward, contrasting themselves with those who did not win a medal at all, feeling thrilled just to have made the podium. Silver medalists tend to compare upward, focusing on the athlete who won gold, experiencing the sense of loss. In short, our perception of our own status and our attitudes about where we stand are not simple functions of our resources or even our absolute place in the socioeconomic hierarchy. They are a product of comparison. When a palace or gold medalist springs up next door, our house shrinks to a hut. And yet, whether we look back at history or into the mirror of present popular culture, we do find upward comparison. America has a long-standing appetite for news from the top, from Benjamin Franklin and Andrew Carnegie to self-help books like Rich Dad, Poor Dad and reality shows like Shark Tank. Our elected officials increasingly hail from the upper classes as well. And modern celebrity culture relentlessly draws attention to the gold medalists of today's society. And in particular, when it comes to American political rhetoric, there's certainly no shortage of upward comparison. Candidates and leaders seem almost unaware of how bad upward comparisons can feel. Progressive Democrats like Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, consistently direct Americans' attentions up, telling Americans to look around, Oil companies guzzle down the profits guzzle down the billions in profits. Billionaires pay a lower tax than their secretaries, and Wall Street CEOs, the same ones that direct our economy and destroyed millions of jobs, still strut around Congress, no shame, demanding favors and acting like we should thank them. So here's another one, so maybe you can think about who this might be. Quote, if you can afford to hire an army of lawyers, lobbyists, and others to help you navigate and sometimes influence the law, you'll benefit. And so that's why you see big banks, big companies keep winning, and everybody else is stuck in being left behind. That was actually Marco Rubio in April of 2015, and he is by no means alone on the political right. In fact, we see upward comparison messaging echoing from both sides of the political aisle. Are these politicians shouting into a void? Remember, people hate the sad silver medalist vantage point. And yet here we have candidates trying to win votes, repeatedly asking Americans to look upward. Megan and I wondered if we could nail down how people respond to upward and downward cross-class comparisons. And we also wanted to look beyond political messages, which, while important, make up only a small slice of our social experiences. What about all those other comparisons we make throughout all of our days? So to answer these questions, we have to learn a little bit about social comparison. Now, you might ask why we have a slide up here with a bunch of images of children. Well, it turns out that we compare ourselves to others starting at a very young age. And this can tell us something about how social comparison works. I regularly hear my young children proclaim that they're taller, shorter, faster, slower than their siblings. These sorts of comparisons help their cognitive development because social comparisons are often how we understand social arrangements that we are not already familiar with. As we progress into adulthood, our use of social comparison matures with us. As adults, we routinely rely on them to process information more efficiently and to make judgments. And just as children do, social comparisons are particularly important when we are faced with social structures that are complex or unfamiliar. And yet, comparison across class lines has received very little attention in many prominent attempts to understand Americans' responses to one of the most complex and rapid shifts to the social order in a generation, the rise in economic inequality since the middle of the last century. In part, due to this oversight, we're left with many unanswered questions about the national reaction to growing inequality. And in particular, public opinion in the United States has not responded to rising inequality the way many experts predicted that it would. The long-standing expectation has been that as inequality increases and more people fall further from top earners, the public will demand more redistributive action from government. People will recognize their slipping status, concern about inequality will boom, support for a government response will grow. But the reality runs counter to this expectation. Americans have trouble identifying their own positions in the changing economic hierarchy, and appetite for redistribution has remained relatively stable, I'll emphasize relatively, for decades. The connections between Americans' opinions and socioeconomic status, which social scientists often capture by looking at individuals' incomes and resources, remain weak and hard to predict. So perhaps, in answering this question, why are Americans not more supportive of a more expansive social safety net or more economic redistribution? Perhaps Americans are ignorant, lacking the factual knowledge to respond rationally to growing inequality. Or perhaps they're tolerant, accepting of inequality because of fierce individualism, ideology, or deeply held beliefs about mobility and the American dream. Perhaps instead, people are not, I should say, our argument here is that we're going to depart from the standard, what we call the information deficit perspective and the ideological acceptance perspective, and instead argue that it's possible that people are not responding to inequality in expected ways because we are increasingly insulated from the upward social comparisons that make inequality real and meaningful in our everyday lives. So this is the wealthiest street in America, and it's telling that it is actually an island. So Megan and I approach the mysteries about economic inequality and politics in a slightly different way. Yes, we know that economic inequality alters people's objective socioeconomic status, affecting both the demands that they make on government and what they want government to do. But we believe that subjective status perceptions are also an important part of this process. And as we've already discussed, these perceptions are determined in large part by social comparison. We will show that in particular, when people look up at the rich, they feel lower and want government to increase social spending. But three countervailing forces gum up the works. First, to understand the relationship between inequality and politics, we have to go a step back and investigate the opportunities people have or lack to confront others who are economically different. In particular, we test and show that in an increasingly unequal United States, growing class segregation limits opportunity for upward comparison. Second, growing economic anxiety increases a desire for downward comparison to boost a sense of self in the midst of anxiety-producing change. Both of these forces seriously limit upward comparison, interrupting, if you will, the connection between inequality and political demands. Third, when upward comparisons do occur, they might make people want more from government, but they also depress political efficacy, making people feel less confident about their own capacity to get in the ring and affect change. Now, because we're interested in understanding the response to inequality, we focus on cross-class comparisons, but we point out that social comparative thinking can never be scrubbed of race or gender, the way statistical information about broad economic trends can be. And so we will also examine the ways in which the intersections between class, race, and gender influence both which comparisons Americans make and how they react to them. Race and gender undergird all of the forces and processes in this model, structuring opportunity for social cross-class contact, increasing anxieties, shaping stereotypes of the rich and poor, and providing a means for many to avoid thinking in terms of uncomfortable class differences by focusing on other differences, just as Wolf and King described. Cross-class social comparison also interacts with race and gender to affect some people's attitudes more so than others. In all of these ways, attention to social comparison reveals the impossibility of solving mysteries or puzzles about class and American politics without investigating race and gender. So throughout the book, Megan and I point out the many ways in which race and gender determine the nature and impact of cross-class comparisons. And I'll be highlighting a few of these today. So in doing so, we aim to complicate what we think has become an oversimplified dichotomy between class politics and what is sometimes referred to as identity politics. So we draw on many data sources and methods to put this theory to the test, and I'll be talking about them more in a moment. But our core method is an experimental manipulation in which we ask large, nationally representative samples of Americans to imagine having a conversation with someone from the top or bottom of the socioeconomic hierarchy. So we show subjects the MacArthur ladder of subjective status and ask them to imagine that the rungs of the ladder represent where people stand in the United States. We ask them to contrast themselves to this imagined other at the bottom or the top. That's the random assignment. And thus we are able to manipulate experiences of social comparison, holding constant people's resources, ideology, values, and social circumstances. So our book draws on a wealth of experimental and observational data. We conducted our main experiment with 2 separate nationally representative samples of US adults, each with about 1,000 participants. In addition, we have, in addition to the experimental manipulation, it includes a large free writing exercise. So after people are randomly assigned to compare up or compare down, we ask them to imagine a conversation, a social interaction, and then we ask them to write about it. Who's the person that they imagined? What did they talk about? How did it go? How did it make them feel? In total, we have over 1,300 written responses from 2 large nationally representative samples. And in the book, we devote 2 chapters to analyzing and interpreting this qualitative data. In the interest of time, I'm going to focus on some of the other results today, but I will give you some sense of these findings as well. We pair our experimental studies with observational data. Do the experimental results that we observe match up with the real world? And here we're drawing on survey data from the American National Election Study and the General Social Survey. And throughout the book, we have supplemented our main experimental studies with supplemental experiments to kind of tease out the implications of various pieces of our model. So I'm first just going to kind of briefly walk through some of the open-ended responses to give you a sense of how Americans responded to our study. What we find is that Americans do resent the rich. Here's just an example. I don't think that people at the top of the ladder would have anything to do with me, and that's fine with me. But at the same time, Americans express admiration as well as feelings of personal inferiority. I always feel like what I say is being dissected or not important enough. We do find sympathy for the poor. So here's one participant who wrote to us, I think I'd be sympathetic and try to help with the situation. This is someone who was engaging in downward comparison with someone at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder. But that sort of sympathy is repeatedly qualified or walked back. So here's the same respondent, same participant. However, I would also expect this person to help themselves. I don't particularly like lazy, and therefore would have to believe in the sincerity of the person before I would take the extra to assist. We see and observe in the open-ended responses some racialized and gendered class images, that these images of the poor still persist. As one person wrote to us, I pictured single mothers with children, their children poorly dressed, they all have phones and are heavy set. And in fact, in an additional kind of supplemental experiment, we indeed show the ways in which poverty in the United States remains deeply racialized and gendered. Finally, we find across both the upward and downward comparison conditions that thinking about the economic other induces and influences kind of these self-referent evaluations. So here's someone who wrote like, I'd feel uneducated. Okay, so I'm happy to come back to the qualitative data that we've collected in the book, but I do want to show you some of the results from our experimental studies. And I'm going to begin with how social comparison affects perceptions of status. So the first thing to note is that Americans do see themselves as middle class. This middling tendency is part of our political culture, and there's just pride in being seen and seeing oneself as part of this politically popular middle class. So here's just data from the General Social Survey showing the share of respondents who are placing themselves at the top of the ladder, in the middle rungs, or in the bottom. And you can see overwhelmingly that Americans identify with the middle. So people place themselves in the middle regardless of whether they're at the top or the bottom. So here's just another way of taking the data that I'm showing you on this slide. And here what I've done is just compared it to where an individual's actual income and family size places them in the socioeconomic hierarchy. This gives us some sense of how accurately they perceive or place their relative social position. So you can see that most people place themselves in the middle, regardless of whether they're at the top or the bottom. But our social context and networks also help to reinforce these perceptions, or misperceptions, if you will. Sociologist Rachel Sherman, for example, finds with surprise that some of the wealthiest New Yorkers, here we're talking about like the top 1%, that these Americans too describe themselves as middle class because they're comparing their status to someone even higher up, say someone in the top 0.01% of the income distribution. And at the lower rungs of the ladder, Americans work very hard to distance themselves from the bottom. It's what economists have called last place aversion. And they do so by comparing themselves to someone in worse straits. As one recipient of the Earned Income Tax Credit told sociologist Sarah Meakin-Halpern, quote, "It's not like I'm poor." So we test how social comparisons affect perceptions of status using the experimental manipulation that I described earlier. And as we see here, in this figure. This is the results of our experimental study. You're looking at the average self-placement between subjects who are assigned in the upward comparison compared to those who are randomly assigned to the downward comparison. So we see here that those in the upward comparison condition place themselves further down the ladder than those in the downward comparison. And we ran an additional experiment that I'm not going to show here for time, that likewise shows that downward comparison boosts one's sense of status relative to someone who just sees the ladder and is just asked, place yourself on it, but receives no instruction about looking up or down. And what's more, we show in a supplemental study that lower status white Americans, these are white Americans who do not have a college education, get an even bigger boost to downward comparison when that downward comparison is with a racialized other. Further, social comparison with an economic other, we show in the book, actually makes us, I should say, can make us more accurate about our own place in the income distribution. But it depends where you yourself stand. So if you're someone in the top half of the income distribution, you tend to underestimate your relative social position because you claim that you're part of the middle class, but engaging in downward comparison, engaging in downward comparison makes you more accurate about your position. And the same holds for those in the bottom half who are looking and engaging in upward comparison. What's kind of remarkable, I'll just stop here or pause for a moment, is that these perceptions of status, they are remarkably flexible. We have folks shifting in response to a very brief imagined interaction with an economic other. Indeed, in our open-ended responses to this manipulation, we find that getting Americans to think about an economic other gets them to think deeply about their own status. And when their attentions are drawn up, they express a great awareness of the distance that separates them from the top, letting us know it ain't me. So what about opinion? Post-treatment, we asked a short battery of public opinion items measuring support for spending for redistributive social programs, and we use these to create a single measure. If upward comparison causes status perceptions to fall, does it also increase support for economic redistribution? The short answer is yes. Subjects become more supportive of spending. They are more supportive of increased spending on redistributive programs when they're assigned to compare up. So what you can see here is, in contrast to subjects in the control condition who did not engage in any sort of social comparison, support for social spending is higher in the upward comparison, and that difference is statistically significant. In contrast, those that were randomly assigned to engage in downward comparison are not necessarily less supportive or more supportive. They're kind of, it looks indistinguishable from the control group. And in the Q&A, I'm happy to talk. There is indeed more heterogeneity, some variation in how Americans respond to downward comparison, particularly differences between men and women. Okay. So the results of our experiment make our puzzle even more puzzling. The rich are pulling away from the rest. And if people are so deeply sensitive to class divides, why aren't we seeing this shift in public opinion like we observe in our experimental studies? So Megan and I argue that income differences are not the only thing changing with growing economic inequality. And in the book, we focus on three countervailing trends. Class segregation keeps us from looking up. Economic anxiety makes us want to look down. An upward comparison, when it happens, depresses our sense of political efficacy. So I'm going to show you really quickly one set of findings from the observational studies that we've done, research that we've done. And what we did was examine the relationship between residential income segregation and status perceptions in public opinion using observational data from the GSS. We matched respondents to their zip codes and took advantage of data that were graciously provided to us by Pat Flavin and Bill Franco, who've calculated a ratio of individuals in the 80th to 20th percentiles by zip code. This measure is scaled such that higher values mean that you live in a zip code where you're more likely to encounter rich people versus poor people, and vice versa. And using these data, I'm just going to skip here. This is just kind of showing that segregation in all sorts of domains has has grown in the United States. And so the results from our study here is that exposure to, this is observational data, that non-wealthy people, here I'm just showing you the results for a non-Hispanic white subject with a household income about 30,000, that they have a more accurate perception of their relative status when they live in zip codes where they're more likely to encounter an affluent other rather than a disadvantaged other. Further, we find suggestive evidence that lower income Americans living in such zip codes are more supportive of redistribution than those who live in zip codes where the rich are relatively invisible. And this model, I should say, it controls for a lot, including partisanship and ideology. Further, we show that lower income non-Hispanic white Americans have higher and therefore less accurate status perceptions when they live in more racially integrated zip codes, in effect, getting an extra boost to how they see themselves from the presence of the racialized other in their community. And so this is showing you again the relationship for education and for welfare. So beyond context and contact, we argue that economic anxiety, which has also increased as inequality has grown, may play a similarly insulating role. Social comparison serves a number of helpful functions. Social psychologists have shown how downward comparisons can help us cope, help us manage difficult situations. So for example, breast cancer patients and math test takers make an effort to focus on those who are worse off, helps them cope, helps them deal with a difficult situation. Does something similar happen with inequality? So we show in the book, and especially in the qualitative data, that thinking about the very rich can make Americans feel angry and resentful. But we also find that upward comparison can be uncomfortable, maybe even distressing, particularly if we are already feeling the squeeze. So here we, in a separate experimental study, we adapt what's known as like a bottom-up manipulation from work that Bethany Albertson and Shanna Gadarian have done on anxiety and politics. And what we did here, I'm just going to note on the slide, before I'm going to show you the manipulation, just how widespread economic insecurity and anxiety is in the United States. In a marketplace survey conducted in 2017, you see that 2 out of 3 Americans report feeling financially insecure. A separate Pew study found that 9 out of 10 Americans would prefer financial stability rather than like social mobility, moving up the income ladder. In 2020, as the pandemic was, when we're really in the depths of it, 1 in 3 Americans were reporting trouble paying the usual household expenses. And this comes after years of research showing just large numbers of Americans who don't have savings to kind of deal with everyday expenses, like a leaky pipe, a car repair, let alone something more difficult, say a unexpected medical bill. So I mentioned this bottom-up manipulation. And so what we asked people to do is they were randomly assigned to either a control condition or this anxiety condition. We asked people to kind of just take a moment and to think about the economy, their personal finances, what makes them worried. And we just asked them, write about it for a bit. And here are just some of the responses. That I don't have enough, I'm paycheck to paycheck, I'm worried about paying my debts on time, paying my bills, worried about high health insurance, high deductible job security, a husband starting a new job at a much lower salary. People had a lot to say, and they wrote quite extensively about their economic worries. Following that, all subjects were then presented the ladder, and again, told that that ladder represents where people stand in the United States. And then we just said, we're going to ask you to read a news article about someone from the ladder in their life. And then we're going to ask you a few questions about how you're different from that person. And the outcome variable that we're interested in is looking at whether or not they prefer to compare up or do they prefer to compare down. And here are the results. Those assigned to the economic anxiety condition relative to those who were not express much greater preference for downward comparison rather than upward comparison. So before I conclude, I just want to say, that perhaps these dynamics feel similar. Trump, as we explain in the book, seemed to really grasp the power of social comparison. His political rhetoric is really peppered with references to social comparison, kind of seeming to grasp the ways that downward comparison can boost the sense of status of his supporters. This was from his famous speech as he's descending the escalator to announce that he's running for the presidency, reminding and telling his supporters about when migrants are coming over the border of Mexico, they're not sending you. They're not sending you. And Trump, of course, was very famous for repeating the phrases that he wanted to emphasize. Okay, so before I conclude, I want to just make mention and note one final factor that insulates Americans from increasing economic inequality. So social comparison not only suggests that individuals are using comparisons to make sense of status and it can shape their opinions, but that comparison also affects our abilities and capacities to act and perform. Upward comparison made people in our studies feel small. Did it also make them feel politically less than? So we conducted another set of studies examining how comparisons affect political efficacy. Here, we focus on internal political efficacy, and these are the measures used to measure our construct, because it most closely captures that sense of capability that psychologists have shown to move with social comparison, and because other scholars have repeatedly demonstrated its close relationship to socioeconomic status. So I'll just show you one set of results. This is from a study in which we have a control condition. We have a condition where people engage in upward comparison, a condition they engage in downward, as well as a ladder-only treatment that draws attention to social stratification, but doesn't prompt them to engage in any sort of social comparison. And the results are striking. Those assigned to compare up express lower levels of efficacy compared to all other groups. So in a democracy, preferences are important, but only in so much as the people who hold them can be mobilized to act. So here we've identified a final social comparison-based phenomenon insulating American politics from inequality. That the very same messages and experiences that induce people to want more government action to address inequality can be disempowering. And in the book, we present some suggestive evidence that this depression seems especially pronounced among those who are underrepresented in the political sphere. So I began with several unanswered questions about the national reaction to growing inequality. Under what conditions do Americans consider the economically mighty and the weak? What do they think about when they compare themselves to others across the class divide? How do those contrasts make them feel about themselves? And what, if anything, do they want government to do about it all? So attention to social comparison, its prevalence, our responses to it, and in some cases, our resistance to it gives us new answers and uncovers an important way in which inequality is reinforcing. So social comparison is an important power resource that can and is wielded with intention by political actors. So here again is former President Trump. This is when he was holding a rally in Duluth, Minnesota. And Trump's rhetoric was filled with social comparison. And until recently, certainly Megan and I were following it throughout the 2020 presidential campaign and the Democratic primaries. And we tended to hear a little less of it from Biden. But it was also changing over time. So this was from one of the presidential debates. So here's Biden in response, and he's going toe-to-toe with Trump here. You know, this guy and his friends look down on so many people. They look down their nose on people like Irish Catholics like me who grew up in Scranton. They look down on people who don't have money. They look down on people who are of different faith. They look down on people who are a different color. Our findings suggest this kind of message may well persuade, but it can also be uncomfortable and demobilizing. So there's little controversy about the fact that economic inequality in the US is large and growing. Our aim has been to investigate how people perceive it, and in doing so to offer a different way to address persistent puzzles about the American response to it. It is our hope that political theorists, practitioners will listen closely for social comparison as they probe the interworkings of economic difference, perception, and politics. And with that, I will close and look forward to your questions.
Okay, great. We have several questions coming. Let me begin, though, with asking you a little bit about going back to some recent politicians, and not just Donald Trump, but also Bernie Sanders. And there's been a lot of work done on, in fact, their rhetoric and how it's changed from previous politicians, this populist rhetoric. And one of the things I was struck by was some work done by Michael Sandel. And he notes that what populists on both the left and right have done, Bernie Sanders, Donald Trump, is they talk less about social mobility. They don't talk about opportunity. In fact, they rarely mention opportunity. And rather, they talk about social winners and losers. And they talk about it precisely in those terms, undermining the idea of social mobility. And so I wonder what you think about that. I mean, is really the change that's taken place in our class perceptions shift away from this idea that we have social mobility and a recognition that we don't any longer? And is that what's driving populist politics?
Well, I'll start with the last point. I think there are many factors driving populist politics. So I'll just acknowledge that. In terms of, perceptions of social mobility or desires for it, for sure, public opinion data show that Americans do, on average, hold faith in the American dream, but that sort of faith has faltered a bit, particularly since the Great Recession. In the book, we cite other research, qualitative ethnographic research of people who have been interviewing and following closely kind of the struggles of those in the bottom third of the income distribution, if you will. Those who you might think in previous times would kind of look to have do better than their parents, have belief that their children will do better than themselves, but really kind of throwing up their hands and kind of saying it. They're not seeing it. They're not observing it in their day-to-day lives. And in fact, what comes through is preference and craving for stability, for economic security. And so there's research kind of looking at the wild swings that many American families face, that sort of income volatility we know has grown as economic inequality has increased. So I'm thinking here of the work of Jacob Hacker and others, that sort of looking at the ways in which the structure of the social safety net has shifted a good bit of risk onto the shoulders of Americans and their families. And that sort of income volatility, that swinging, it makes people much more present in the immediate moment, wanting essentially just security. Now, there are certainly cases, and in the book we describe, and we tell the story of a family in Ohio. They're kind of recounting kind of the bets that they're making on social mobility, the idea that they're going to, the wife is going to go back and she's going to get a master's degree to try to break into, a new profession. This sort of but for these families, it's often like it's a gamble. And so I think that is perhaps why you don't see that sort of optimistic, more hopeful sort of rhetoric. The candidate from 2016 who used it was actually Jeb Bush. His campaign was called Right to Rise and kind of had that sort of social mobility message kind of peppered throughout. And of course, we know that Jeb Bush did not make it through the Republican primary. So it seems that in recent years, we've been kind of locked in this sense of like zero-sum sort of politics. Moving forward, Megan and I are working on the next book where we're really interested in interrogating and really thinking about ways to disrupt the sort of zero-sum politics that we're seeing kind of emerge on both the right and the left, and thinking about it in terms of positive sum politics. So we're at the very early stages of this research. But it's a great question about where social mobility fits into this broader story that we're telling.
Okay. Alex Hammond asks a question. He says, can you explain as simply as possibly the different perceptions of class position and inequality by U.S. populations of such heritage as Asian Pacific Islanders, Latino populations, African Americans, that you found, factoring in gender and actual economic status?
Yeah, so the first thing is that very little variation in terms of what I would call the middling tendency. Most Americans, regardless of background, demographic groups, and so on, see themselves, so tend to place themselves toward the middle of the distribution. I mean, there in the book, we kind of show that these perceptions of status do track with objective socioeconomic status. So it's not like those at the very top are placing themselves, way far down. I mean, it does track, but there's this central tendency, this middling sort of tendency. In terms of perceptions of inequality, I'll actually draw, I wanted to pull in, I think, a piece, I can see the chat, a piece about racial inequality. And we know from other research the ways in which white Americans in particular really underestimate things like the Black-white wealth gap. They tend to overestimate the ways in which it has economic divides have closed between African Americans and non-Hispanic whites. And part of the story there is this sort of social insulation and the deep racial segregation that still exists in our society, and having these very visible markers of Black progress. I mean, certainly having Obama as president helps to give this very visible marker of socioeconomic achievement. In terms of other divides that we see, I'll just say two things. One, and this kind of links back to the earlier question about social mobility and perceptions that if you can just work hard, you can make it. To be sure, that just runs, it's a theme that runs throughout all of the responses. Those that are looking at both the top and toward the bottom. The idea that and this is, we see this, it tends to be political conservatives tend to emphasize it a little bit more, but not exclusively. And we kind of see Americans from all sorts of political backgrounds kind of emphasizing those sorts of themes. And then the final thing I will just say is that it's quite uniform, the sort of depressive effects that we observe with looking up, with one exception. There is one social group that seems to be a bit more immune to the depressive effects of upward comparison, and that's non-Hispanic white men.
Marcia Garrett asks, can you tell us how the growing number of strikes against major employers like John Deere and Kaiser Permanente and the Hollywood production workers fits into your construct? Are these examples of individuals looking for redistributive policies? And secondly, how does the massive number of employees who have left the workforce, the resignation nation, it's being called now, fit into your paradigm as well?
Yeah, wonderful. So I'm going to piggyback a little bit on the political efficacy results. So in the last chapter of the book, we kind of start to sketch out some ways that might interrupt this sort of relationship. And here I'll just speak to the relationship of looking up and feeling low and kind of producing this sort of political quiescence, if you will. Part of this is that we've had in the United States kind of the decline of labor unions that historically have helped build that sort of social solidarity in many key sectors of our economy. And we know that today the percentage of the workforce that is unionized is low, it's shrunk, and it's comparatively low compared to other advanced industrialized democracies. We do sketch out cases in which we've seen in certain communities, certain areas, people kind of overcoming those sorts of collective action barriers and feeling empowered by working together. So we tell the story of domestic workers in New York City, for example, that won a domestic workers' bill of rights in New York State. These are women, mostly immigrant women, who are providing caregiving services to like wealthy families in New York. With the case of these sorts of strikes that we're seeing, I mean, part of that is the sense of that things are possible. With a tighter labor market, workers have more bargaining power. And I think that is changing their perceptions about the likelihood of movement or success when it comes to what they're trying to achieve in terms of better pay and better working conditions. So I do think that the tightening labor market that we've seen in recent years is helping to reshape and change those sorts of perceptions, whereas before it felt, and what we observed in our data was a very isolating, insulating sort of individualistic sort of response about it's too much. They're too far away. It's too great. What can I do about it? I'm just, a lowly, ordinary voter.
So Brianna Wadley asked a question. You might have already addressed this, but you might be able to expand on it a bit more. She asks, are social inequalities the same for all races, since Blacks and Hispanics experience demographic, economic, and educational disadvantage? Other than education that causes income inequality, what other social inequalities do Caucasians experience?
Yeah, so, well, first I'm gonna point to some great work kind of looking at the Black-white wealth gap, for example. And what that research, I think it was at Brookings, has a wonderful kind of report kind of laying it all out. That if you're looking at the Black-white wealth gap, that you see that sort of endure kind of regardless of education, regardless of income, suggesting that it is not explained by just educational differences or income differences, that it is speaking to kind of the enduring legacy of segregation, of Jim Crow, especially exclusion from the housing market. And that what you're observing is effectively the intergenerational wealth transfers that have taken place over many decades and generations. In terms of other sorts of social inequalities, I will say some other pieces that we touch on in the book. We think about kind of growing homophily or affinity, particularly in marriage patterns we're seeing amongst increasingly trend among white Americans, that wealthier white Americans are more likely to marry someone else who's from their socioeconomic class. That's a change, actually. There was more sort of cross-class marriage, kind of marriage across class lines, I say, 40, 50 years ago, and that you've gotten this sort of kind of interlocking trends in which if you've now got two earners who make a lot of money, the household wealth that they have is just twice as great. So that's just one example. And then I'll just, I'll stop there and I'll take a few other questions. Great question.
So let me just follow up on this question about education levels, because there's a lot of evidence to suggest right now the greatest political divide in our country, especially amongst white Americans, is education level. If you look at the way those with a degree in higher education or above behave as opposed to those without a degree. Did you break down your data along those lines to see if those with degrees engage in social comparisons differently than those without degrees?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, we did look, and I do have, I can share the sort of reaction there. So the first point to make there is, if you are looking, we do know that from the 1970s, 1980s, that sort of college wage premium grew considerably. So if you were someone who had a college degree, you could command a higher wage. And the sort of premium, it grew dramatically. It's actually shrunk a little bit in recent decades, if you're looking at data from like the mid 2000s on. But that sort of growing gap between those with a college degree versus those who don't, if you're looking at sort of, and I'm sure you had Professor Deaton here kind of talking about kind of life outcomes and what sort of social group has kind of seen life outcomes and social progress kind of stagnate or fall. It is white men without a college degree. We show this in the book in terms of it translates even to their perceptions of status, kind of where they fall, the sort of sense that they're further down the social order. Megan and I have a separate piece that actually shows how variable that is and how it intersects with partisan politics. But in terms of preference for comparison, what we observe, that craving for downward comparison slightly greater amongst those without a college degree, first off. So that sort of boost to status, that those who have college degrees are just not as troubled by, if you're thinking about that economic anxiety manipulation I showed you and how that induces a preference for downward comparison. There, it's primarily driven by those without a college degree. Likewise, when you bring in race into the story and you look at kind of the effects of downward comparison, when it becomes also downward comparison with a racialized other, what we found was that it was white men without a college degree got the biggest boost. So after they were randomly assigned to engage in downward comparison, here the treatment was either they just saw somebody with kind of a white sounding name versus we used a name to kind of induce perceptions of racial and ethnic difference, that white men without a college degree, when they engaged in downward comparison with the racial other, they place themselves much higher on that social, the subjective status ladder compared to someone who didn't get that downward comparison with a racialized other. So yes, class, in defining class in terms of education is a key cleavage, and we see it in our studies as well.
It seems that we somehow lost Amber. In any case, our time is almost up. Let me thank all of you for tuning in today and joining us. I want to thank Amber Wichowsky for a really interesting conversation. I wish we could have finished it, but we had a really good conversation, and she got to most of our questions. Let me remind you that our next event in this series is on November 2nd at noon. We have Chris Farrisee from Syracuse University. He'll be talking about public policy rather than economic forces as a cause of inequality. And so let me again thank you. I'll thank Amber in her absence, but I'll certainly express our thanks to her. We'll see you all in 2 weeks at our next event. Thank you.